Yeah, good morning again and welcome back. This will be our first panel. It will be moderated by capable Abdelhamid Siam. Before we get started, I'll ask you to silence your phones, please. And I'm afraid I might forget to thank our staff for putting this function together. I ask you to join me in giving them a hand of applause for doing a great job. I also don't want to forget to thank our Palestine Conference Committee with the capable Saeed Arikat and Edmund Gharib and few board members who really made this program happen. Without their help, we would have been lost. And thank you guys very much. The interns are part of this staff, absolutely. Interns, each one and everyone. Right. So I want to say a few words about our moderator for this panel, and he will introduce his speakers. Abdelhamid Siam is currently a lecturer of political science and Middle Eastern studies at Rutgers University. I don't know if I'm saying it right, Abdelhamid. Yes. He worked for the United Nations for many years. Before he quit the United Nations, he survived the bombing of the UN headquarters in Baghdad in 2003. Then he decided to move on. He's currently the bureau chief of Al-Quds Al-Arabi at the United Nations. He has written several books and in the process of writing others. Abdelaziz writes regularly for Al-Quds Al-Arabi. I read his articles all the time. And it is my pleasure to hand the program over to Abdelhamid to introduce his speakers, and he will be entertaining the questions and answers at the end. Abdelhamid.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eid. It's my pleasure. I want to thank you and thank Dr. Subhi and my lifelong friend Saeed Arikat for inviting me to chair this panel. It's my honor, really, to be part of your activity today. And I have been associated for a long time with the Jerusalem Fund. And I want to first thank my panelists. It's a great honor. I can say one word that describes them all. It's courage and speaking truth to power. With these kind of scholars, we will make the difference in the United States. I want to also thank my student who came from New Jersey, Shannon Crow-Cliff. She's doing her MA thesis on the Arab-Israeli conflict and in particular what's happening in Gaza now. Thank you, Shannon, for coming. Okay, we will organize this panel. I'll give each speaker 20 minutes, after which we will open it for question and answer. I will introduce the speaker as he or she starts speaking, and then I will give you the floor. Our first panelist is Professor Raz Segal. And let me introduce him briefly. Dr. Raz Segal is an associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide studies. That's what we need now to hear from you. Your expertise will show. He's studied many cases of genocide at the Stockholm University. Dr. Segal has held a Harry Frank Guggenheim Fellowship, a Fulbright Fellowship, and was recently a senior fellow at the Vienna Weizsäll Institute for Holocaust Studies. His publications include Genocide in the Carpathians War, Social Breakdown, and Mass Violence, 1914-1945. And he served as a guest editor of the Hebrew language special issue on genocide, mass violence, and culture eraser. He's at work on a book on the distortion, weaponization, and mobilization of Holocaust history in the reproduction of white supremacy and state violence, including a focus on Israel assault on Palestinians from the 1948 Nakba to the current genocide assault in Gaza. In addition to scholarly publication, he has published op-ed books, book reviews, and large articles on genocide. Without further ado, I want to give the floor to Professor Raz Segal to introduce his.
Thank you so much, Abdel Khamin, and thank you for the Jerusalem Fund, and it's an honor to be on a panel with you, Lily and Josh, as well. So I'll jump right in. Can you hear me like this? Is this good? So on October 21st, Israeli Jewish settlers and their supporters gathered outside the Gaza Strip for an event titled "Preparing to Settle Gaza." The event, held in a closed military zone, included Israeli Knesset members, Israeli parliament members, and government ministers. They discussed their vision of the complete expulsion of Palestinians from northern Gaza and the building of a new Israeli Jewish city on the ruins of Gaza City. You can hear me there? Yes? Meanwhile, the Israeli army was moving forward in the brutal implementation of the general's plan. The intensified total siege on northern Gaza, accompanied by an attack by Israeli forces that have killed on average 100 Palestinians a day for more than 30 days now, forcing thousands upon thousands to move south. This is precisely what Israeli Knesset member for the ruling Likud party, Ariel Kalner, called for already on October 7th, 2023 on social media, when he said, "Nakba to the enemy now, Nakba that will overshadow the Nakba of 1948. Israeli cabinet minister Avi Dichter described this, quote, second Nakba 2 months later on November 11th, openly on Israeli TV as the Gaza Nakba. And Israeli soldiers and officers on the ground leave us no doubt that they understand perfectly well the destructive goals of the Israeli government in its attack on Gaza, as this photo shows. We are thus witnessing a shift from Nakba denial, which is a structural element in Israel and the West since the 1948 Nakba. So there's a shift now to a discourse, an explicit discourse, that admits the Nakba as an ongoing process. Now, perpetrators of state violence rarely shift from denial to recognition in this way, certainly not during unfolding violence. This is very, very exceptional. There are a number of things that are very exceptional in Israel's attack on Gaza, and this is one of them. We see it in this case because of the perpetrator's state of mind. Israeli leaders and soldiers and officers who have documented their own crimes in Gaza in thousands of videos and uploaded the evidence onto social media, they imagine that they are fighting a colonial war against, quote, human animals, as Israeli War Minister Yoav Gallant described Palestinians in Gaza on October 9th, 2023. And I do think that we should start calling, well, Gallant, as you know, has just been removed, but I think that, you know, we need to refer to him as war minister rather than defense minister. Such explicit language, human animals, brings to mind the German general Lotto von Trotha, who issued an extermination order in response to the violent uprising of the Herero people against German colonial occupation and oppression in Southwest Africa in 1904. That order signaled the beginning of the German genocide of the Herero and Nama people. Similarly, Israelis perceive their genocidal assault on Palestinians following the Hamas attack on October 7th as a war against colonized barbarians. This is, in other words, Israeli settler colonialism taken to its horrific conclusion. Israeli leaders have been explicit and open about their settler colonial ideology and policies. Israeli President Yitzhak Herzog, for instance, responded in an interview on MSNBC back on December 5th to a question about the intense killing of Palestinians in Israel's attack on Gaza, and he said the following: "This war is a war that is not only between Israel and Hamas." That's how he started the response, which is very telling because he tells us explicitly that this is not just about Hamas, right? It's a war, he continued, that is intended really, truly to save Western civilization. We are attacked by a jihadist network, an empire of evil, and this empire wants to conquer the entire Middle East, and if it weren't for us, Europe would be next, and the United States follows. End of quote. Do you remember this? This interview that Herzog gave? Herzog built on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's infamous association in late October and early November of Israel's attack on Gaza with a biblical story of Amalek. That was just as Israel's ground invasion of the Gaza Strip was beginning. This is a story, of course, of the Israelites destroying completely a people perceived as a whole as an enemy, as the ultimate enemy, as the ultimate evil. But Herzog placed it on a modern scale as the last stand against apocalypse and the demise of Western civilization. He thus expressed a colonial rationalization of destruction of people under colonial occupation. But here, taken to extreme, couched within a discourse of religious war that points to the Jewish supremacy as a manifestation of white supremacy at the heart of Israeli settler colonialism. Israeli leaders with what we call command authority in international law have used such religious discourse from the very beginning of the assault on Gaza, including numerous references to a struggle against evil or to Gaza as a city of evil, as Netanyahu said again already on October 7th, discussing a war of the people of light against the people of darkness, as Netanyahu explained in a speech on October 25th and in many other speeches and occasions. As with admissions of Nakba and calls for a second Nakba, this discourse hardly remained confined to the leadership level, and officers and soldiers in the Israeli army have been mirroring it constantly on the ground in Gaza. A video created by Israeli soldiers, it's not this yet this one, we'll get to Chemo in a minute, but a video created by Israeli soldiers in the Sajaiya neighborhood in Gaza on December 8th, for instance, shows them setting fire to a truck with food and water in it. This particular video has since been removed. Many have not. This one, for example, you can still find online. How they describe what they are doing is horribly revealing. And this is a quote from the soldiers. It is the second candle of Hanukkah, the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. We are in a factory of candy that is given to children who carry out terror attacks. We are bringing the light to this dark place, burning it until there remains no remnant of it. End of quote. Now, if, as Israeli President Herzog said back on October 13th, 2023, all Palestinians in Gaza are responsible for the Hamas-led attack on October 7th, it follows that Palestinian children receive candy not because they are children, but because they are terrorists. It is also not at all by coincidence that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said in a message to Israelis 3 days before this video, on 5th of December, he said the following: "This week we will light the first candle of Hanukkah. Our soldiers will bring light to the darkness, in the alleyways of Gaza, in the ruins of Sajaiya, in the terrorist lairs in Khan Yunis. The light together, as a great light, will cleave the darkness." Right? So soldiers on the ground, right, are mirroring genocidal language immediately, right, in relation to genocidal rhetoric by leaders. On December 21st, to take another example, a platoon commander in a reserve battalion spoke in a public event that was recorded in honor of the battalion and its role in Gaza. The reserve officer summarized the biblical story in Genesis 34, where Shimon and Levi, sons of Jacob, conduct a revenge attack on the people of Nablus in response to the rape of their sister. The reserve officer then explained that what Shimon and Levi did in Nablus, his unit did in Bet Hanun in Gaza. But the mission is not yet complete, he said. we still have the whole of Gaza to do what we did in Bet Hanun. Now, importantly, the Genesis 34 story, in this case, actually disapproves of the act of revenge, right? So the biblical story actually is against the act of revenge. So the officer needed to distort the biblical text in order to fit it into the genocidal message he conveyed to his audience. Not surprisingly, this was a religious Zionist officer, right? So he knew exactly that he was distorting the biblical text here, right? This is important as it demonstrates that the issue at hand is not the established or accepted scholarly interpretations of biblical text, Amalek, this text, or any other one, right, used to justify and rationalize Israeli genocide, but mostly the way Israeli Jews understand and use them publicly, popularly. Right? Thus, Captain Chaim Chemo, deputy commander of a company, posted a video of himself on January 13th, saying the following: "With the help of God, we have destroyed a vast area of Gaza and killed tens of thousands of Amaleks. But we are not yet a moral army. This is the real war of the people of Israel. Moral is to understand every Arab is a suspect. Maybe he is good, maybe he is a bomb, but he is a suspect. Moral is to execute all the terrorists after interrogating them. Moral is to conquer and settle all of the land of Israel, and every place we will leave a wasp's nest, they will retaliate against us sooner or later." So here, very clearly, Chemo understands the biblical Amalek story as the basis of a moral framework. And this is very important because we know that in every case of genocide, right, the perpetrators have a moral framework, a moral framework. His moral framework is that all Palestinians are enemies, who therefore should be executed. This is furthermore articulated within a call to occupy and settle the land of Israel, here clearly as a religious construct, without leaving any wasp's nest, so also concluding this with explicit dehumanization. These are just a few examples among thousands of videos by Israeli soldiers and officers that demonstrate a connection between explicit expressions by Israeli leaders, war cabinet ministers, and senior army officers of what's called in the UN Genocide Convention, intent to destroy. In this case, intent to destroy Palestinians in Gaza as such. That is because they are Palestinians. So there's a connection between this intent, intent is a very, very important factor in the international law of genocide. There's connection between this intent, as we saw, and the dynamics of violence on the ground as the soldiers and officers are explaining it to us. So indeed, Chemo understood Herzog's assertion on October 13th that, as Herzog said, it's an entire nation out there in Gaza that is responsible for the Hamas attack on October 7th. And he understood Netanyahu's references to Amalek as they were intended. Palestinians in Gaza as such, that is, all Palestinians in Gaza, are enemies. This is the reason that Israeli bombings and invasions have left the Gaza Strip in utter ruin, as Israel targets everything: residential buildings, hospitals, schools, all the universities, cultural sites, archives, museums, bakeries, agricultural fields. Israel has killed so far, according to UN estimates, over 43,000 Palestinians, including over 16,000 children, many of them, by the way, in areas where Israel has forced Palestinians to seek refuge as, quote, safe zones, right? So Israel has weaponized international humanitarian law that tells armies that they need to evacuate civilians from war zones, right? So Israel has weaponized this in one of the most densely populated areas on the earth, right, in order to enhance the targeting of Palestinians, right? What Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967, she has called this humanitarian camouflage, right? To use international humanitarian law to enhance genocidal violence. The real number of Palestinians that Israel has killed are most likely far higher, with over 12,000 bodies that remain under the rubble. and a letter to Biden on October 2nd, just recently, 2024, by 99 US physicians and other healthcare workers who have volunteered to work in Gaza after October 7th. In their letter, they note that Israel has killed so far about 120,000 Palestinians killed. There's also, of course, more than 100,000 injured, but just the number of people killed is a horrific figure. That means 5% of the total population of the Gaza Strip Israel has killed so far. Now, the view of all Palestinians as such, as enemies, is also the basis of Israeli War Minister Gallant's total siege policies that he declared on October 9th, 2023, when he referred to Palestinians in Gaza as human animals. Cutting off a territory from food, clean water, fuel, and medical supplies completely, right? Total siege, which, by the way, he coined a new term on that 9th of October, total siege, right? Does indeed target the people who live there as a whole as such. That is because of who they are. This total siege, which followed 17 years of Israeli siege on Gaza, which is the longest siege in modern history, set the stage for the displacement that Israel forced on nearly the entire 2.3 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. 80% of the Strip is now under Israeli-issued evacuation orders, again, this weaponization of international humanitarian law, so that the vast majority of Palestinians have experienced multiple forced displacement in conditions of mass starvations, with more than 1.2 million people now facing emergency or catastrophic levels of food insecurity. Almost no medical treatment, Israeli bombings totaling so far more than 90,000 tons, which is, as we've heard, 4 atomic bombs of the kind that this country dropped on Japan at the end of World War II, and Israeli forces on the ground led by officers like Chemo. Taken together then, Israeli policies and mass violence in Gaza since October 2023 have, in the language of the convention, the third kind of violence, deliberately inflicted on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Indeed, if Israel's attack stops now, Palestinians in Gaza will continue to die in large numbers from hunger, disease, exposure, and the lasting effects of physical and psychological trauma, in the hundreds of thousands, probably, as a result of the conditions that Israel has intentionally created in its attack. And of course, as in all cases of genocide, trauma and suffering will accompany survivors and their descendants for decades and generations to come, because that's what genocide is always intended to do. Israel's attack on Gaza, then, is a textbook case of genocide. It's actually textbook in a number of ways, intent that matches dynamics of violence on the ground, and siege policies, right, that fit precisely the UN definition, again, the third act of genocide, leading genocide studies scholar Elisa Merjian recently to coin the term Gazification. Gazification. Now, importantly, Palestinians in Gaza understood the destructive nature of the attack against them from the very beginning. And I'm just going to quote a number of examples. There are many. A community worker, started sending WhatsApp messages, and we have a lot of these WhatsApp messages and text messages, which are really a form of testimony. They started sending these messages to friends on October 10th with only 3 words in the first one: terror, terror, terror. On October 15th, he wrote, "They are killing families, whole families. I want to forget what I saw. You can't imagine, beyond reality." 2 days later, water and food, none, very little. We went to sleep in 2023 and woke up in 1948. He noted on October 18th, this reference to the Nakba. Andalib Adwan, a feminist writer and educator from Gaza City, remarked in a WhatsApp message on October 9th that the situation is indescribable and the horror is beyond imagination, and more and more. I also want to note who in October, he's a journalist and translator in Gaza, in October wrote in a WhatsApp message, "Where is the West? Where are those human rights they preach? Where is international law? This is genocide, and it should be immediately stopped." Now, the West, of course, was and is busy working, 3 more minutes. The West, of course, was and is busy working exactly in the opposite direction. right? Ensuring that the genocide can continue to unfold by providing Israel with arms and diplomatic cover. The overwhelming support of the US in particular has made this genocide really a joint US-Israel genocide. And the extent of US support for Israel for more than a year now has surprised and shocked many people around the world, right? Because it is in the face of escalating violence, because of the largest mass protest movement in the US since the Vietnam War, because Palestinian citizens in the US who have lost family members in Gaza, because of the overwhelming and growing resistance to what's happening among Jews in the US, because of the large, unprecedented killings of journalists, aid workers, UN workers, because of the angry resignations of people in the UN and in the US government in response to this, because of the regional war that Israel has created and its attacks now on Lebanon, Syria, and Iran that actually run counter to US interests in the Middle East and the Gulf, right? And because Israel has spat in the face of the US government again and again, and it crossed all the red lines that Israel itself has set, right? Every time to receive more money, more weapons, more support. Why is this? And with this, I conclude. The answer for this US support is rooted not just in the obvious denial of what we all see in front of our eyes and our screens this past year. So there's this as well, right? There's the outright denial. It's not just about the role of Israel as a proxy for US interest in the Middle East. It also harks back to the denial of the Nakba and its rationale, the denial of Israeli settler colonialism. This denial has now become particularly absurd in view of Israeli leaders and politicians and Israeli Jewish settler leaders declaring their settler plans openly in gatherings such as the one right outside Gaza this past October. But the US government must deny Israeli settler colonialism, for recognizing this very well-documented reality, past and present, may open the floodgates and force recognition also of settler colonialism in the US, which is also, of course, denied and blurred and rationalized and disavowed. It would mean, in other words, coming to terms not only with the foundational crime of the Israeli state, but also that of the US state. And if there is anything that we can learn from the elections we just had here, it is the extent to which US settler colonialism is a non-issue for establishment politics. This dismal state of affairs is one way to understand the settler colonial vision for Palestine and Palestinians. But the shift from Nakba denial to recognition, now in the perpetrator state and society of Israel, and the fact that Israel's attack on Gaza very much fits the definition of the crime of genocide in international law, this has thrown the international legal and political system into an acute crisis that now offers us new opportunities in the struggle for truth and justice in Palestine and beyond. Now, to be sure, we are up against incredible power, but a quick look at the history of the long 20th century that we are indeed actually stuck within it, right? And I'm a historian, so I'll end as an historian. A quick look at this history demonstrates how incredible power can crumble and has crumbled in the face of sustained struggle and resistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Raz, for such an eloquent and powerful speech. You have pointed out that the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide is being shown in this case. It has two elements, the killing of a certain members of a group and the intention to kill this group, and both the killing and the intentions are there, and you eloquently showed that. Thank you again. My next panelist is Josh Paul. Glad to have you on this panel. Josh Paul is a director at the New Policy. He resigned from the State Department in October 2023 due to his disagreement with the Biden administration decision to rush lethal military assistance to Israel in the context of the war on Gaza. He had previously spent over 11 years working as a director in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, which is responsible for U.S. defense diplomacy, security assistance, and arms transfer. He previously worked on security sector reform in both Iraq and the West Bank, with additional roles in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, U.S. Army Staff, and as a military legislative assistant for a member of U.S. House Armed Service Committee. Josh grew up between London and New York and holds master's degree from the University of Georgetown and St. Andrews, Scotland. He is recently a non-resident fellow at the organization Democracy for the Arab World. Now, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Siam. Thank you to the Jerusalem Fund for hosting us today. Thank you to my co-panelists, Lillian and Dr. Segal, for that, I think, quite powerful walkthrough of the genocide we are seeing playing out with our own American complicity. What I'd like to speak to today in that context is a policy element of that complicity, how it came about and how it plays out, and why it continues to bind the United States into this model, which Dr. Segal touched on in the closing there of his remarks. Perhaps I just want to back up quickly and explain, for those of you who aren't familiar, as Dr. Siam said, I left the US government in October of 2023. And when I did so, there were three reasons that I cited. The first, the most immediate, was the devastation that was occurring in Gaza through the use of US arms. That is a devastation, of course, that has only deepened and expanded since then, while there has been no change in the US policy of providing those arms. But of course, that was the most immediate and compelling reason. The second, of course, was that when I tried to raise my concerns in this respect, there was a silencing of debate. And I think this is a silencing of debate that will be familiar to many people for many years when it comes to speaking about Israel and Palestine, and one that we have seen play out in the public sphere, in addition to the government sphere, over the course of the last year, particularly when it comes to how colleges and universities have approached speech on their campuses, but also in the private sector and also in other contexts in American life. But the third reason, was that I also at the same time raised a concern that US policy on Israel-Palestine had been broken for many years and was clearly not working, and particularly, I think, as we saw in the wake of October 7th, had reached a dead end, but even before that point. And the piece of that policy that I want to really focus on today is one in which there is a concept. So if you look at the Israeli-Palestinian quote-unquote peace process, the Israeli conceit about it has been this idea, theoretically, at least back in the 1990s, and going back to when it was the Israeli-Egyptian peace process in the 1970s, of land for peace. The American contribution to that, particularly since the 1990s, but since before then as well, has been security for peace. And it is that concept of security for peace that I'd like to dig into today and try to deconstruct, because I think that it is at the root of many of the failings that we are talking about, and frankly, at the root in part of the genocide that Dr. Segal just discussed. So there are four flaws, I believe, to this approach. Of course, this approach is the notion that Israel's fundamental challenge is that it is surrounded by enemies. If you look at Israeli propaganda and Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs brochures, they will show you this map of Israel surrounded by countries that are highlighted in red because of all the enemies around them. And so the concept is that, look, if only Israel was secure enough, felt secure enough, it would then be able to make the concessions to the Palestinians necessary to get to a lasting peace. And therefore, the US role here is to provide that security. And the way we have done that, of course, is, for the most part, through the provision of arms, through the provision of weaponry, security assistance, billions of dollars a year of US taxpayer funding that goes to making Israel not only secure, but under US law, gives it a quote-unquote qualitative military edge. This is something that is written into US law, that when we are looking at our security assistance, our arms transfers to every other country in the world, in the Middle East rather, we must take into account how Israel's qualitative military edge will be impacted, which is its ability to defeat any country, any combination of countries, any non-state actor, while suffering minimal damage. So this is the policy, this is the strategy. And again, the idea being that if Israel is secure enough, then peace is possible. So let's talk about 4 reasons, I think, why that is a fundamentally flawed approach. The first is that just as a theoretical underpinning for any sort of peaceable settlement, it is not one, if you look at the historical track record, that works or that commonly applies, right? I think if we think about the contemporary world and where we see examples of a security-based peace, those are not great examples of a lasting peace. The most obvious, I think, among them, for example, is Korea, where we see the Korean peninsula divided between South Korea and North Korea with a demilitarized zone in the middle, and the idea that the only way to sustain peace on the peninsula is through immense military presence of the United States, this demilitarized zone, overwhelming power. This is, of course, a fundamentally unstable solution. This may lead to temporary stability on the Korean peninsula. It does not certainly lead to peace between North and South Korea. In fact, technically, there is still a state of war, not only between those two, but with the United States as well, that has not been resolved. We also see, of course, in the contemporary world, the idea of security for peace being one advanced by President Putin in Russia, who argues that Ukraine somehow poses a threat to Russia, and that therefore Russia needs security in exchange for peace. And that security must come through the form of occupation of some lands and assurances that NATO will never, be part of that Ukraine will never be a part of an attack on Russia, will never be a part of NATO. Here again, we see that this is a facade, and that security for peace actually leads to insecurity. If we think about other contexts, let's also talk about the internal context when we look at Israel, of course, which Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others, including myself, and I think very clearly is an apartheid state. It is a very unusual idea to think that what the party imposing apartheid needs in order to step back from that apartheid is security. The notion, for example, that white Americans in the Jim Crow South, in order to reduce that bias, that bigotry, to step back from those laws of the Jim Crow South, what they actually needed was to feel more secure. I don't think you would have seen anyone arguing that, just as in the Republic of South Africa, as it went through its transition from apartheid into democracy. There was, that no part of that solution involves strengthening white police forces in order to make sure that white people felt more secure. So that is not part of the solution. The only place, perhaps, where security for peace has been a part of a solution, and I do not say it is a good one, is the one that Dr. Segal actually just referred to, which is in the context of colonization. And I'm thinking here in particular, again, actually, of the United States, where we see the American colonization of the West. We see actually a security for peace model. If you think about the expansion of fortresses, if you think about sort of the 1850s, 1880s, that period of Custer, and the expansion into the West, the forcible displacement of Native Americans repeatedly, their location, they're pushing into reservations, and a lot of the very similar language that we see being used by American government officials at the time and American military officials to describe the quote-unquote savagery of their enemy, even at the time that a savagery of a far, far greater scope was being carried out about the native population. But there is an example, I'm afraid to say, where security did coincide with peace. And I think we need to be very conscious about that one example as we think about the US policy towards Israel and Palestine and what security for peace means in any other context, because I don't think it applies in any other context but that one. Three more issues with the security for peace model. The next one is what it means for the Palestinian people. What is the role of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian government, the Palestinian Authority, in the context of a security for peace model. I think what we have seen is that security for peace ultimately means the instrumentalization of the Palestinians as a tool of Israeli security. I mean that, first of all, in terms of the Palestinian Authority. My own experience, I lived in Ramallah in 2008 to 2009 for 14 months for something called the US Security Coordinator. This is an organization that still exists there. Its purpose is to build up Palestinian security forces on the theory that as the Palestinians stand up, the Israelis will stand down. You can get to a two-state solution. That is the theory of the case. In my experience, of course, the Palestinians, I will be honest, the Palestinian security forces did stand up, certainly in that period, and for many of the wrong reasons continue to. The Israelis never actually stood down. And part of the problem we had, so, I had an apartment in Al-Bira, if any of you are familiar, on the north side of Ramallah, which looked down the valley, and on the opposite side of the valley, there was an Israeli, or there still is, an Israeli military base and a settlement. And on a regular basis, Palestinians would come down the hill from Ramallah, from Al-Bira, to protest. The Israelis would come down from their military base. There would be a clash, and this was the regular pattern. And particularly during what was then Operation Cast Lead at the end of 2008. This was the first major Israel-Hamas conflict in Gaza that took, I think at the time, about 2,000 lives, which at the time was horrific. During that conflict, I sat there on my balcony and I watched Palestinian protesters come down from Ramallah. And then as the Israelis started to come out of their gates to come down, something new happened. A line of men in blue uniforms and white cars drove in and put themselves in between the Palestinian protesters and the IDF and pushed back the protesters. And this, of course, was the Palestinian police, Palestinian National Security Forces, and other Palestinian forces that the USSC had been working to build. And this was, in the USSC terms, a great success. Look how good the Palestinian security forces are. Israel can rely on them to defend the IDF. What a great success story. Of course, what this actually means is that what it means to the Palestinian people is a devastation of the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority. Because if we think about the purpose of security forces, they are a service provider to the people who they serve, right? To serve and protect. Who are they serving and protecting in this context? Is it the Palestinian people? No, it's Israel. So that is one example of the instrumentalization of the Palestinian Authority and why that fails on that basis to provide security for peace. And then, of course, what is the role of the Palestinian people as a whole? This, I think, touches on another thing that Dr. Segal just said, which is that horrific quote from President of Israel, Herzog, who said, it is an entire people that is responsible, talking about October 7th. What does it mean? If it is the role of an entire people to be your security, to provide your security, to prevent attacks on you, then it is the fault of an entire people if that fails to happen. So that is, I think, a second deep flaw in the security for peace model. The third flaw I would point to is, of course, the currents that we see in Israel. I do think that there was certainly a time in which there was a movement for peace in Israel, both in the 1960s and even in the early 90s, the Oslo period. But there's also always been other currents in Israel, and those are the ones that are dominant now, and I think will be dominant, I fear, for many years to come. And those are the currents of expansionism, colonialism, and Jewish supremacy. And what does it mean? How do you have security for peace for a country that is actively involved in expanding its own boundaries, in colonizing, in annexing? There cannot be, security becomes not security for peace, but security for expansion, security for apartheid, security for war crimes. So I think that there is also a fundamental conflict. And in order to have security for peace, you have to have a partner for peace. And I do not believe that right now in Israel, I think it's pretty clear, there is not a partner for peace. And therefore, again, the model fails. The final way in which I think the model fails, and this is the point I will end on, is that what is security, right? I mean, we know what security assistance is, right? That's arms and training. We know what military equipment looks like. We know what walls look like. Those may contribute security in some cases, but ultimately security is a feeling, right? We feel secure, and one cannot provide a feeling if it is not there, if it is not being nurtured, if it cannot exist. And I think that we have to think about it in that context as well, because one of the things we see from Israel and have seen increasingly, but I think have seen going back almost to its founding, is the also instrumentalization of insecurity as a key selling point. Israel is the only place where Jews can feel secure. Israel is, needs this security assistance, is reliant on this alliance with the United States and others for its security, and this is, and also, frankly, I think sustains a lot of its internal debate. One of the things we've seen repeatedly in Israeli politics is that things begin to fracture and fall apart when the focus is off security, when there is stability and peace, and when the drive to sort of push this argument of insecurity reduces. And so I think the sense of insecurity is in many ways fundamental to at least Israel's own sort of political continuation. I think that is a deep problem that Israel itself and the people of Israel have to address. But I think that for as long as you are saying security for peace and premising that on a national psychology that rejects the possibility of feeling secure, it is going to always be a policy that fails. So on that, I will leave it there and turn it over to Lily. But again, I think that at the end of the day, we have to look not only at the facts of the genocide, the failures of international law, but also the failures of American policy and the failed bases and premises on which those have been developed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josh, for this powerful speech about peace for security. I remember after the Oslo Accord, Yitzhak Rabin was asked on CNN, and he said, our state is secure, but we need security for Israeli individuals. And that's what they wanted from Oslo, only security for them. And when I asked a few young men, I was visiting Palestine at the time, why you are jubilant about Oslo Accord? They said, we were told that this will end settlement, prisoners will be released, and we will see our state. And Yasser Arafat used to repeat again and again, the Palestinian state will be established, and the flag will be rising on Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Church of Holy Sepulchre. If they want it or not, let them bring the Sea of Gaza. But look at that, where we stand now with the peace for security. And my next panelist and the last, the best for the last, is Ms. Lily Greenberg Cole, is a former special assistant to the Chief of Staff of the Department of Interior. She has nearly a decade of experience in politics, movement organizing, and domestic and international human rights work. She worked on Vice President Kamala Harris, 2020 primary campaign and President Biden's 2022 campaign, and served in the Biden administration until May 15, 2024, when she became the first Jewish political appointee to resign in protest of US policy in Gaza. Lily grew up doing pro-Israeli lobbying with AIPAC, and she was president of the AIPAC affiliate group at her undergraduate at the University of California, Berkeley. Though her work in international human rights investigation, refugee aid, and time spent in Israel and Palestine, she became invested in Palestinian human rights and Jewish anti-occupation movement. Her resignation protest from the Biden administration came after months of attempting to use her experience as a Jewish person with both Israeli and Palestinian loved ones who was impacted by the events of October 7th to convince the administration to change course. Lily has appeared as a guest speaker and analyst at MSNBC, CNN, NBC, and given commentary and written articles for the Washington Post, The Guardian, and many others. She holds a BA degree in political science and public policy from the University of California. Lily, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Josh and Raz. Really an honor to be on a panel with both of you. Raz, especially, you're a little bit of a hero in the worlds that I'm in, the lefty Jews. So it's really wonderful to be here. And thank you to the Jerusalem Fund for having us. I'm gonna move this up a little. I also can, well, I use the mic. I guess if we're recording, it's important for the mic. Yeah, I might do that. So I'm not. Okay, this is better. Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, I just want to name, I don't know if we did this before, but like, you know, I am arriving here obviously very, feeling very sad and very discombobulated and dysregulated. And I'm sure that a lot of us are. And even listening to, you know, what Raz and Josh just described, and for so many of us that are like personally connected to what happens on the ground in Israel Palestine. Yeah, I wanted to name that and say that I'm like happy to be here with all of you in this day and this week in particular. I was going to talk about my resignation, you know, as the focus, but I actually think there's more. I think I can speak to some of the reasons why what my other panelists described happen when we are thinking about trauma and the feeling of security. And so I, as the professor said, I was a political appointee in the Biden administration, which means we serve at the pleasure of the president. That is actually the exact line. Appointees are the folks in the administration who have the most proximity to political power, typically, and are specifically, you know, appointed and chosen by the White House. Typically, people who have worked in previous, you know, in campaigns or other administrations of whatever that party is. And so, as a political, your job. You are really not supposed to disagree or publicly at least disagree with the president. Your role is to execute the priorities of the administration. My actual job hadn't, you know, I was not working on foreign policy. I was not working on anything around Israel Palestine. I was working at the Department of Interior, which is actually a few blocks away. I used to walk by this building sometimes on my little work midday walks. But that was going to be impossible for me to do after October 7th. And as the professor mentioned, I attempted, so I spent many months while I was still inside the administration attempting to use what felt like my proximity to power to influence administration leadership and people in the White House. And maybe that was naive to think that they would be receptive to that, but it felt like what I needed to do in the moment. And it also felt like I was uniquely positioned to at least feel that they could not tell me that I did not know what I was talking about. And I had a lot more, I felt much more secure in speaking out than a lot of my colleagues as a white person, as a Jewish person, and as someone whose community was deeply, deeply impacted by 10/7. My sister had a friend who was killed. I know several people who were killed. It was a day that, you know, rippled through my community of both Israeli Jews and American Jews. And and then of course, I was also immediately terrified for all of my Palestinian friends who live in the West Bank and the people that I knew in Gaza, which the administration was not as concerned about. But yeah, so all of that, bringing this to the administration leadership and kind of, I spent many months telling people, I do not feel safe from the policy choices you are making. What you are doing is not making my community any safer. And if anything, you're manipulating our trauma and then making us the justification for what is being done to the Palestinians in Gaza. And in many ways, making us the face of the larger American war machine. And I want to center on that in what I'm going to talk about and how it connects to everything that was spoken about, because one of the main reason I resigned in the way that I did and chose to do it publicly after I made the decision for myself that I had to leave for my own integrity and sanity was because I think American Jews in particular have a unique role to play in revealing and sort of exposing the mirage that the US government says that Jewish safety is the reason for continued US support for Israel. Because that is not true, and it has never been the case. There's many reasons for US support for Israel. I tend to think of them in terms of 4 pillars. If you draw kind of a like Greek, building in your head, and we have the columns. One of them is the American Jewish community and the ways that my community buys into and continues to support US support for Israel. That is there. But that is just one of the pillars. The other 3 are US military interests, the military-industrial complex, and Christian Zionism, which there are more Christian Zionists in the United States than there are Jews in total. And it is an incredibly powerful force in American psyche and American politics. And no one really knows what CUFI is, Christians United for Israel, but everyone knows what AIPAC is, which, ultimately AIPAC also does masquerade as a Jewish organization. The managing director is a Christian Zionist. His name is Arnie Christensen. But they are seen and presented as a Jewish organization. And so as American Jews, right, I think, for the people who have been organizing in this space for the last decade or so, the community we are accountable to and have roots in and are a part of is the American Jewish community. So we can do our part to try and shift that community's support. But what covers all of those pillars is this sort of curtain of quote unquote Jewish safety. Because it's much more palatable for people to think, we are continuing to send money and weapons and choosing to support and fund and enable a genocide, because that is what has to be done to protect another persecuted people, historically persecuted people. And most Americans, I think, I'll say when I lived in Iowa working on Vice President Harris's campaign, there were a lot of people I met who had never met a Jewish person, but most Americans have met Jews more than they have met Palestinians, or are more familiar with Jews, right? And with our story and with our experiences as a community. So that is the reason. And we know that is not true, because ultimately Israel does not make Jews safe. Safety does not come from apartheid and militarization and occupation. And, even having the idea that you are going to be safe because you have to send your 18-year-olds to serve in the army instead of to university or on, a gap year or anything else that a child who's 18 years old should be doing instead of having a gun, that is not real safety. And I think that really gets to what Josh is saying, that safety is a feeling. And part of the reason why Israelis and Jews do not actually feel safe is because we have been sold this lie, essentially, that our safety must come at the expense of Palestinian freedom. And after the trauma of the Holocaust and the thousands of years of persecution before then, and the very real way that anti-Semitism exists in this world, and in particular in European society as like a foundational building block of European society, of course Jews don't feel safe and secure, and have immense trauma, as Raz said, the way genocide continues to live in people's bodies and in their cultures and in their communities for people who survive for years and years. I mean, I see it every single day in my family and my community, and the part of my family that did not survive the Holocaust is a different branch, right? Because thankfully, the ones that I am directly from had already left. But it doesn't really matter because it's still here. I sort of forget where I was going with that, but so the reality is, right, of course, the status quo does not keep us safe, it does not make people safe, and it did not solve anti-Semitism. And the way the US-Israel relationship functions is, if anything, kind of a manifestation of how anti-Semitism has always worked historically. In many communities, right, and countries across time, Jews are isolated from other people. And then we are later scapegoated when things go poorly by the ruling class. Oftentimes, Jews are able to cooperate with the ruling class more than other people, and for various reasons. And so we do that because of perceived safety that we will gain from that cooperation, which then further isolates us from other people who we do really need to be in solidarity with. And this cycle perpetuates. And what is happening with the state of Israel is really that cycle on a global scale in a way that we have not quite seen it before. And I think inside the administration, actually felt like I was seeing a lot of these dynamics take place, or sort of experiencing them on a personal level, as well as what we were watching happen in this country and in Palestine. Being told by seeing the most powerful people in the world, including the president, use my community's safety as a justification for genocide, and then to see the way, not only that people in leadership who said they were doing this because they cared about my community and they cared about our safety, not only did not want to hear from me as someone who was directly countering that, but also were clearly very threatened and interpreting what I was saying as, making trouble, as like all of the various, negative associations that are like thrown at people who are, daring to speak up for Palestinian human rights. And also just the sort of basic, clear lack of understanding from so many people that I worked with that someone like me could even care about Palestinians, could have people in Palestine that I was concerned for, could even just, if I did not have that on a human level, obviously be devastated by what was going on. And I think that separation in people's minds, and that exists, right, between the Jewish community and the Palestinian community because of what has happened in the last 100 years, only further benefits white supremacy and white nationalism and ultimately Christian Zionism. And I think we are in now a particular moment after this election where we have to get really, really clear about who our enemies actually are. And people in my community need to get very, very clear about the fact that, yes, we have assumed whiteness in so many ways. We have gained immense power, and we, Jewish Israelis bear a particular responsibility for what has happened to Palestinians. But all of this is conditional on our compliance with and, behavior in accordance to what the ruling class of whiteness really wants. And as soon as we step away from that, and we see that with the way that, people want to define anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, and then that will extend to the two Jews on this panel here. I mean, anytime Jewish people step away from that, we no longer benefit from whiteness and from what that compliance has given us. And so, I definitely don't feel like I have all the answers for this, and have also not really been like a functioning person for the last 2 days. But I do think I'm hopeful. I am thinking about this moment as a particular time for us to break through some of that mirage even more and really rip that curtain off. And I don't know, right, if that will be successful, and especially, convincing the many, many people in my community who unfortunately have been so baked into and bought into this lie of Jewish safety through occupation and through apartheid and through oppression. But I am certain that it is like the only way that we are going to get through this, and also the only way to actually create a sustainable, just peace in Israel-Palestine, and everywhere, right? That the way to create a real multiracial democracy that means a thriving future for every single person, whether that is here or in Palestine or anywhere else in the world, is going to require us a new paradigm than what we've been doing for the last however many years, but especially the last 100 years. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think our panelists deserve another round of applause. I will lead by posing one question for each panelist and then open the floor for more questions. My question to Professor Raz: I have been working for the UN, and I was there when the genocide happened in Rwanda, 1994, and in Bosnia, 1995, in June. And again, lately as a journalist, also what happened in Myanmar. So there were cases of genocide. But first, these genocides were not visible at the time. We knew about them after the fact. We didn't have much documentary to show. But here, there is a genocide taking place in Gaza. We see it. We see it day in and day out. It's live. We see people being shot and killed as we are watching TV. However, none of the UN officials or others recognize that this genocide, with the exception of Francesca Albanese, she was the only courageous non-UN staff. She's not a UN staff. She's special rapporteur. She recognized this as genocide. How could that happen? How do you explain that?
Do you want me to?
Yeah.
Oh,
Please.
okay.
You lead way, yeah. And then I'll ask Josh and.
Okay, I'll try to be very brief about this, even though it. So look, let's think about the crime of genocide in international law. Maybe I'll do this as well. Let's think about the crime of genocide in international law. It was created in 1948 in the convention, okay? The immediate background is what today we call the Holocaust. No one used the word at the time, right? That means the immediate background was the Nazi genocide of the Jews, right? And it was perceived immediately to be unique. Now, why was it perceived to be unique? Because there was an urgent need to detach Nazism, right, from the West, and particularly from colonial genocide, right? In order to present Nazism as somehow an accident, a mistake, and an otherwise history of Western progress. Otherwise, you have a problem with the idea of Western progress, obviously, right? Okay, there's a lot more to say about all of this, but what we call today the Holocaust unique, okay? With that, immediately, 1948, also the Nakba and the creation of Israel, the state where indeed a lot of Holocaust survivors tried to build their lives, right, also becomes by implication the Holocaust unique, the state of the survivors as it was perceived, also unique. Now there's actually, it's a triad of uniqueness because it's the Holocaust, Israel, it's also Jews as a unique people, which has of course deeper roots in Western civilization, quote unquote, right? So Holocaust, Jews, Israel, unique in relation to the new crime of genocide, right? This is the context of the, now, Why is this important? Because this means that when international law reemerges after World War II, with genocide as its key innovation, right? It emerges with this context of uniqueness, Jews, Holocaust, Israel, which means that Israel immediately becomes the state where, in this framework, it becomes unimaginable that it could perpetrate any crime under international law, let alone genocide, which also means that Nakba denial, right? What everyone saw in front of their eyes then as well, without technology, right? And certainly Jewish Israelis and Holocaust survivors, by the way, right, had to be immediately denied as a structural element in the new system of international law and what we call today Holocaust memory. No one thought about that at the time, right? But in relation to the Holocaust, the new crime of genocide, so international law, Holocaust memory, Israel had to be exceptionalized in a way that it cannot perpetrate crimes under international law, right? This is a very powerful idea. Again, there's so much more to say about this, especially about Jews and the role of Jews in Western civilization, right? As seen by Jews and others, right? But this means that it's very difficult, right, today to come to terms with what is really an accident of the system. The fact that we all see in front of our eyes, as I argued, a crime that fits exactly the definition of genocide in international law perpetrated by Israel. As long as we were in the realm of what's called in the study of colonialism and settler colonialism, slow violence, even though it's not slow, right? That was fine. We could all, hang on to the facade, to the discourse, right? But now it's not slow, right? It's extreme and it's actually genocide according to international law, right? This is a challenge to the political and legal international system since World War II that is unprecedented, right? And that's why it's so difficult to recognize it as such. Again, there's much more to say, but I'll just say this.
Thank you so much, Professor Raz. I would ask Josh. You resigned in October last year. That means over a year. That was a courageous decision from the early days of the genocide in Gaza. And it's been over a year now. Have you imagined that this war will continue until today? Have you imagined that we're 85,000 tons of explosive dropped on Gaza, killing as many thousand as you know? What did you foresee when you resigned? Would it continue until a year after? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. So I would have to say, first of all, let me just address that word you just used, that I resigned early. I didn't know it was early. I didn't think it would be early. It was 10 days into an operation that at that point had already killed at least 3,500 people in Gaza. And so it was in the context of what I experienced to be an unwillingness within the Biden administration, even with 3,500 dead in Gaza, to reconsider any of the policies, any of the decisions that were being made. I want to contextualize what was happening as well by saying that my belief, particularly since I worked in Ramallah in 2008, 2009, was that the trend line that we were on was one of the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And that I had, been trying to raise these issues within government, during that time and since then, but that, this to me a year ago, even before it unfolded to the extent that it has now and became clearly a genocide, was, if nothing else, simply an acceleration of an existing trend. And therefore, it did not surprise me at the time. And I would say I am not surprised, I'm sorry to say, at where we are. I am surprised that it has, this particular genocide and this attack on Gaza has carried on for as long as it has. I did not think that we'd still be sitting here almost 13 months later. In fact, 13 months later, right? With bombs still dropping, with executions in the streets, with the ethnic cleansing of north of Gaza, with the expansion into Lebanon, with the both settler and IDF attacks on villages across the West Bank, with the laws that Raz referred to that continue to expand the genocide and the capacity for it, and the exclusion of Palestinians from their land and society. So in that respect, it has all been, much worse than I even feared at the time I left, but not surprisingly so. And if anything, the disappointment, in addition to the disappointment, the sadness, the tragedy that we have seen unfold in Gaza, in the West Bank, across Palestine and in the region, is that it has not sparked any sort of reckoning here in the United States or in that building just a block that way, the State Department in which I worked.
Thank you. Lily, you have worked with the Biden administration. I want to ask you to give us some reading of the new Trump administration. Would it be different? How do you see that? Would he learn something from the mistakes the Biden administration committed, which ended up in losing the elections?
Don't hold back.
Well, I have no inside knowledge for the Trump administration, unfortunately. Do you mean like what mistakes are we talking about?
I can count a few
Yeah,
that led to the failure of the
specifically like around Gaza or
no
in terms of the election?
in general. I mean, they lost the elections for many reasons,
Yes.
including their hesitation and their support of the genocide. It was one of the reasons, but I can count many. I wrote an article about that, and I counted at least 5 reasons for the failure of the Harris campaign to reach the White House. So, but one of them is their position vis-a-vis Gaza. They were behind the Israeli atrocities. They cast 4 vetoes in the Security Council. They kept talking about asking Israel not to attack civilians, all these things, which we knew that it just threatened. So how do you see the Trump administration taking from that lesson?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I don't think they're going to learn anything. I don't think they're interested. These are not reflective people, and neither are the Democrats. Neither is the Biden administration. I mean, if anything, I place most of the. I think one of many mistakes, and I'm actually not really in like the place to do my takes yet totally, but I do think one of the biggest failures from like a sort of campaign perspective was the fact that it was almost the same people running the Harris campaign who were running the Biden campaign and who were running the Biden administration. And the one time that there was a boost of excitement and energy within the Democratic base, and not just within the Democratic base, but kind of across the country, was when Biden stepped down, and it seemed like there would be an opportunity for something to be different. And instead of Democrats did what Democrats have done very well for the last 10 years, is instead of listening to that and thinking, oh, okay, this is clearly what people want, they decided to go in the exact opposite direction. I think I do not think we should trust in any way, shape, or form that that the Trump administration will bring peace, as they have said that they would. I do not think we should trust that these people are friends to the Palestinians, I mean, really anyone but themselves. I think we have to remember that Bibi Netanyahu has been banking on Trump winning the election for the last year, and has been very, very excited about it. the Trump administration was the only administration in U.S. history to, and I'm not the academic here, so maybe the scholars can like fix my language on this, but to actually recognize Israeli sovereignty in the West Bank. And I think that paved the way for an acceleration of expansionism. And then, of course, the movement of the embassy to Jerusalem. Miriam Adelson, Sheldon Adelson's wife, also donated an immense amount of money to the Trump campaign under the condition that he would accelerate the annexation of the West Bank. Also one of the first things that the first Trump administration did was to gut the Iran deal. When Obama left office, we did have a deal with Iran, an anti-nuclear proliferation deal, and that was gone almost immediately. I think the new territory we are in here, comparing 2016 to now, is there is a much stronger thread within the Trump base of this whole America First, of sort of the anti-war thing that comes from an actual genuine and and fair feeling that many people in this country have, both on the right and the left, that our resources are not being used well. And it is very frustrating for people to feel squeezed economically, to see their infrastructure falling apart, to not have access to healthcare and basic services, and then to see that we are sending billions and billions of dollars to Israel, and of course, to Ukraine. And that is another thing that folks on the right are particularly aggrieved about, is the money we have spent in Ukraine. I think the dangerous thing about that I see is if you listen to, unfortunately, I do this to myself because I am a masochist. I do listen to Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson and some of what these people say, just to have a sense of what they're saying. And those people will posit themselves sometimes as like allies to Palestinians, or at least they will critique Israel and critique our support for Israel, but it is not coming from a place of real solidarity, and it also very quickly becomes actual serious anti-Semitism, because that, of course, is anti-Semitism is a foundation of white nationalism and Christian Zionism, and so there's kind of these two competing things that I see in the right now. Is we have this what we're more familiar with, support for Israel, that a lot of times I think is motivated by military and financial interests, but also the ideological framework of Christian Zionism, that Jews have to be in Israel for a war essentially between Jews and Muslims, and then that will cause the second coming of Jesus. In that war, most Jews will die. I remind my friends and family that when they think these people are our allies. I think it's like some of the stories are that like a third of them will live, and the rest will be like the bodies that Christians walk on to ascend. Yeah, it's ridiculous, but unfortunately, like that is an ideological motivator for many people in this country. But then the counter to that is newer, that is just this general anti, people who identify as like anti-war because they are against U.S. involvement outside of America. So yeah, I think, as I said before, like this is actually going to require the way we're going to fight this is to build an incredibly large anti-fascist tent coalition, and it's going to involve, I am seeing it even in my community. Like I think there are people, sort of like the MSNBC Jews, which are 80% of Jewish Americans vote for Democrats and have continued to, did that in this election, and we're gonna have to use that as a way to be like, now you need to be in coalition with Palestinians because we are all on the same side here. Yeah, I mean, that's.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I will take a few questions. Please identify yourself and tell us whom you're addressing the question to. We don't have much time, but we'll try to take as many questions as possible. Please. Go ahead. The microphone, please.
First of all, hi, want to thank you all for being in the panel. Second, I'll talk very fast so that everybody else can have a chance. You gave a fantastic, eloquent speech about the history. Being a retired educator from Montgomery County Public Schools, being a Muslim, being a Palestinian, and being a Gazan American, you could only imagine how I felt when either party, political party, won. Because guess what? Their foreign policy is pretty much the same. That's the issue in our country. I did not leave the Arab world to come here only to find out, boom, we're right here. So it is not just the Jews who should be afraid. It should be all of us that should be afraid. And just fantastic. Thank you so much.
We take it as a comment, okay?
Yes, it is a comment.
Thank you. We'll take another question, please. Identify yourself and address the
Thank you very much. I'm Benjamin Tua, a retired U.S. diplomat. This question is directed to anybody that would like to answer it. Dr. Segal, I think you said at one point that current U.S. and past U.S. policies against U.S. interests. The Biden administration has approximately 70 days left in which to take actions. Do you anticipate, any of you, any significant change in the U.S. policy on the Gaza issue, what's happening there, and on Israel generally? There is this 30-day question of reducing aid, or if Israel is found not to be in compliance with U.S. laws.
Thank you. I'll take two questions and then we'll try to answer them. Yes, please, madam.
My question is, all of you have done great, but my question is for Dr. Segal first, and then to Dr. Cole after that.
No, doctor. Just
Anyway, the question is, you are a historian. When Golda Meir and Ben Gurion, they established and started and followed the thing that ended up at what we see now in Israel. The main thought that is that genocide, they started the seeds for it. Being a physician, one of those seeds was when they had the kibbutzim, they made those kibbutzim where the number of Israeli families get bigger than the number of the Palestinian families. And then the genocide went on as we witness it over the years from 1948. And
Could you go to the question, please? Could you go to the question? So
yes, I'm asking you that. That's the reason why. So the question I'm asking you to elaborate on that. And then do you think there was any relationship between Sykes-Picot and this event?
okay, I'll take one more question from this side. Yes, please. And then we will let the panelists answer the three questions.
Hi, my name is Neil Resnikoff. I'm from the Chicago Anti-War Coalition and a supporter of the United National Anti-War Coalition. And I have a question about why all this is taking place. One of the speakers said that he thought it was a mystery as to why this is taking place. We got a few hints from the last speaker over here that there is a ruling class that has some financial and other interests. And I wanted to raise the question about how the British Empire, Winston Churchill, supported the development of Zionism as an agent for British Empire to have a safe area in the Middle East. And this was, the Balfour Declaration was declared with the support of President Wilson and the US government for the same reasons, for a ruling class to gain profits and safety, a secure area in the Middle East. So question of why.
Thank you. I will ask the panelists to answer these questions. It's your choice. Please start. Raz?
On the,
You want to go?
on the 30-day Biden.
Sure, go ahead.
Just, I think if we just take the questions in order, I think the first question on what President Biden can do and will do in his remaining 72 days in office. I think what he actually will do is pretty close to zero. I think that there are a number of things he can do. I think we have to be realistic that for the most part, he has lost the leverage that he had a week ago in this context, but there are still opportunities to certainly two things I would say. First of all, make legal determinations that Israel has been, for example, restricting humanitarian assistance. These are, policies can be rolled back easily by the Trump administration. Legal determinations are just that little bit harder to do. I think the one thing, and again, this is pie in the sky, and I don't think it's going to happen, but there is one thing President Biden could do in the next 72 days that would endure past any Trump administration and at least reframe a lot of what is happening. And that is recognize Palestinian statehood and get the UN to recognize Palestinian statehood. Because once the United Nations has done so, the United States cannot undo that. And that is something that the US needs to use its seat on the UN Security Council to approve. So I think that is the one thing I think President Biden could do that would really leave a lasting impact. And we can talk about what the pros and cons are and why that would be impactful. But that is certainly something within his executive authority to move forward on if he wanted to, but he doesn't.
Thank you, please.
So, yeah, I think that it's very clear. I agree with you, Paul. I think that Biden is acting from a clear ideological position, right? And there's no reason whatsoever to think that he will change this now, right? It's very deeply embedded in how he thinks about the world, right? Now, what is this ideological position? So turning to history, and again, I'll make this very brief, but it's like a whole seminar, really. So what brought us to Nazism and the Holocaust? And there are two key structures of the late modern world that we can't understand Nazism and the Holocaust without them. One is nationalism in the nation-state system, right? And the other is colonialism and settler colonialism, right? I mean, the Nazis, when they went to formulate their Nuremberg laws, their race laws in 1935, they modeled them on US race laws, right? Now, what happened after Nazism and the Holocaust and World War II? Not challenging these processes and structures of the modern world, but reproducing them, right? The nation-state system was reproduced. Colonialism, of course, persisted very, very much, right? And where was this reproduced in the most acute and horrible way? In Israel, right? Israel was established immediately as a nation state for Jews in the name of Jewish safety, right? And as a settler state, right? So the Jewish nation settler state, reproducing the problems that were at the core of making Jews unsafe, right? That led to the persecution and eventual destruction of Jews and Jewish communities, ultimately by the Nazis, right? Reproducing them rather than addressing them. How could ever anyone imagine that that would work well? And of course, it hasn't worked well, right? Now, the idea, now it's important to say, the idea of Jewish safety and security is embedded, of course, in what security means after World War II for everyone. That is the bordered nation state, right? What that means is not just, what this means is that we need to be separate, right? So actually an apartheid mentality globally, right? So security, right? People have a very difficult time to imagine that security could actually be based on people living together. And that's the core. That's why we live in a world with 115 million refugees and other forcibly displaced people. 115 million, right? Today, okay? This is a very key structural problem in the political and legal system around us. It all intersects in the case of Israel, right? And that's why the challenge to the political and legal, international legal system is so significant, right? But it's also a very deeply embedded ideology. And in the US, as I said, it's an ideology about white supremacy, about settler colonialism. This is a settler state, right? This is a state built and based on genocide and the destruction of indigenous people, right? We haven't come to terms with this here in the US ever, right? So we are at a time, we are in an incredibly challenging time. The US government, the Israeli government wants to dismantle the international legal system, right? It wants to dismantle the international legal order, the UN, right? And all that, right? So we are in a time now when we need to think how we can use, right, this challenge to transform these systems. I don't think we should let go of the international legal order at all. I think it would be catastrophic. That's what the US government wants. That's what the Biden administration actually wanted, right? I think we need to find a way how to use this moment of acute crisis, right, to transform the system. And that's why so many people, I understand with that, in the global South are looking at Gaza and they're in solidarity with Gaza because they see very clearly through Gaza their own experiences, right? So there's great potential now for solidarity, for change. Again, the power that we're up against is immense and incredible. It could all fail, right? But it could also work, right? And it's worth the effort.
Thank you. And
I don't know that I have much more to add.
okay, I'll take a few more questions. One round only. Saeed, I'll give you this. I will give you just let Saeed, and you are next.
Very two quick questions. One to Raz Segal. Are we ever likely to see an Israeli anti-genocide movement? And if we are not likely to see that, does that make Israeli society a fascist society? And my question to Josh, is there any possible way, any mechanism to effectuate the Leahy law? Thank you.
Okay, your question, sir?
My question is.
Yeah, speak on to the microphone, please.
My
Introduce
question
yourself.
is for the all panelists. Do they see?
Can you introduce yourself, sir?
I am Tawfiq Ramadan. I am a member of the Jerusalem Fund Board. Do they see an end for this tragedy? And what can we do as US citizens other than shedding tears to alleviate this tragedy?
Okay, the last question I'll take maybe, please. Yes, madam.
Thank you. My name is Bob Griss. I'm a health policy researcher. My question is, is there any evidence that the October 7th uprising was a form of entrapment by Netanyahu? I have heard no discussion of this issue. I was fascinated with the evidence that Raz presented on the long history of this trend toward extermination. And yet I remember reading about Israeli IDF people warning that October 7th was going to happen, and yet Israel has not addressed that issue, and I'm wondering if there's any evidence for this approach.
Thank you. Thank you, and I will start giving Lily the floor to answer.
I mean, to that I'll say, I don't know if there's any actual evidence, but I think that in a lot of ways, October 7th was a perfect storm, and pre-October 7th, 90% of Israelis were in the streets for a year, trying to get Bibi at least held somewhat accountable. And since then, there have been protests. There is, I mean, I think I'll let Raz speak to this more, but I think a very small anti-genocide movement within Israel. But yeah, I mean, there's no better way to get Israelis to sort of rally around someone like Netanyahu than to tell them that this is for their security. I think what we can do as U.S. citizens, we have to build power that is equivalent to the power that the war machine has. That is very, very, very hard. What we need to offer people in our politicians is we need to change the incentives that exist for them to continue supporting Israel and in general, right, supporting the war machine. And we need to give them money and votes. Those are the two things that we need to be able to give them. And there's, you know, a lot of ways that we need to figure out how to do that. But I think we do have a unique role to play given the way Israel functions as a proxy state for the United States, and given the fact that, like, as Bibi Netanyahu and as others have said, this would not be possible without U.S. money and weapons.
Thank you. Josh?
Thank you. I will address two of those questions. First of all, Syed, on your question about the Leahy law. So for those of you who don't know, this is the law that says the US cannot provide security assistance to a unit of a foreign security forces that is credibly alleged to be involved in gross violations of human rights. It is I think, not even a question that there are many Israeli security forces that are credibly alleged to be involved in gross violations of human rights, and yet there is no Israeli security force unit that has ever been made ineligible for US security assistance, in part because we have a completely different process for making those assessments for Israel than we do for every other recipient of US security assistance. This is, I think, actually, first of all, just demonstrates a deep weakness in our legal system and in our structure of government, whereby ultimately, if it is up to the executive branch to decide how to enforce laws without any mechanism from the outside to be able to get it to do so on an equitable basis, you know, this, I think, opens the door to only deeper and further violations of laws. And indeed, I think we will see the upcoming administration find plenty of opportunities to follow the lead set by the Biden administration when it comes to turning a blind eye to the laws that apply to security assistance and arms transfers in particular. But of course, we could also have a discussion about broader war powers issues. I will say, and we're not ready quite yet to preview it, but the organization Dawn, Democracy for an Arab World Now, has filed, first of all, a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act lawsuit with the State Department to demand information about how it is applying the Leahy law or not applying it when it comes to Israel. And there is further litigation in the works that we think has at least a shot at getting a court to make a decision in that direction. But my concern is that even if that litigation was to be successful, given where the US political system is right now, nothing stops the US Congress from coming in the next day and carving out an exemption for Israel. So this is ultimately a political problem more than anything else, which gets me to the question on what can we do as Americans. Tawfiq Ramadan, you had that question. And I just want to build on Lily's response to that, which is to say, yes, we do need to apply the energy and the momentum that does exist now in this country, but has not yet succeeded in shifting the politics and the policies into the political system in a way that registers with the political system. And that does mean continuous engagement. It does mean money. It does mean resources. I believe that those resources are out there, but they are not yet being applied strategically and in a coordinated fashion. And to end with a plug, that is why Tariq Habash, who resigned from the Department of Education as a Biden administration appointee earlier this year, and I have just launched a new organization called A New Policy, which is specifically designed to both lobby Congress and to engage in campaign financing in order to shift the Overton window and get our politicians to say in public what so many of them know behind closed doors, that what we are doing is not only harmful to the Palestinian people, it is frankly also harmful to the Israeli people, and it is harmful to the United States' own interests.
Thank you. And Raz?
Yeah. So there's absolutely no chance for any significant anti-genocide movement within Israel. There are still small, very small, but significant number of Jewish Israelis who have been involved for decades in solidarity and working with Palestinians. They're still doing incredible work. in the occupied West Bank, in the Jordan Valley, in East Jerusalem, in helping Palestinians resist, the incredibly intensifying settler and Israeli army attacks just on a daily basis, all the time. But as a society as a whole, no, absolutely not. Of course, are Israeli Jews secure today? I mean, if there's anything that we could learn from October 7th is that the idea of Zionism as a vehicle for Jewish security has failed miserably, right? Can Israeli Jews understand this? Absolutely not, right? Now, and it's also very, very dangerous because the Israeli political establishment, and it's not just Netanyahu, of course, this is a very, serious mistake to just think about everything through Netanyahu is the problem, we'll remove Netanyahu and everything will be okay. Absolutely. And Netanyahu is very important. He comes from the heart of the greater Israeli ideology, right? But it's not just Netanyahu, but there's a position that has formed now, I think, in the Israeli political establishment and society of an all or nothing kind of which is indeed fascist and incredibly dangerous. But what can we do? So this all needs to come from pressure from outside. And again, it seems it's very difficult to imagine, right, change as this unfolding horrific genocide, continues and intensifies as the war that Israel has created regionally, threatens to explode even further. And all this, of course, puts Israeli Jews, of course, in great danger as well. It's also against American interests. I can't see any American interest at creating a war in the Gulf, for example, right? Just zero American interest in that. But that's where we are now, this potential. What can we do? I'll say very briefly, and I think that Dr. Barghouti said a number of things that are very important, right? The Israeli economy is in shambles, okay? An economy doesn't run on 2,000-ton bombs, okay? So the Israeli economy is in shambles, and we know this. We know this also because tens of thousands, I'm not sure about hundreds of thousands, but tens of thousands of Israeli Jews have left and are leaving. They tend to be the people who can leave. That means that, many people today have a very difficult time getting an appointment for specialist doctors in Israel, for example, right? This all means that BDS, for example, becomes incredibly important. And it has always been important, right? Of course, now we see an attack. We've seen this well before 7th of October, anti-BDS laws, which are a crude violation of First Amendment, right? And so also we see the US political system just crumbling, right, in the face of this. Anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, right, legislation about anti-Semitism in the US, crude violation of First Amendment, right? What this means in relation to what we can do is that truth, right? And again, I'm a scholar, I'm a historian, right? Part of my trade, as it were, is truth, right? Truth is powerful. It's perceived as powerful by those in power, and that's why we're seeing such an incredible attack on truth, which only means that we need to push forward even more, right, on our insistence on truth, which also means, as you said, Lily, that we need to build alliances, as broad alliance. Nothing will happen, this pressure to create an anti-genocide movement globally, right, requires broad alliances, right? That's a challenge in itself. But so creating this pressure, creating this economic pressure, it's all based on insisting on telling the truth. And we're seeing now that, that the facade has fallen, the liberal kind of discourse, right? We can't revert, it's just naked violence and power, right? So the system is in a state of shock, right? And we need to push it forward, right, into change. Again, this is it could all fail, and the power that we're up against is incredible, right? But we see that it also has significant effect, right, in the real world, right? So it's worth to continue this struggle, to develop it further, to build these broader lines, to engage in BDS, in solidarity, and in speaking and teaching and insisting on the truth every single day.
Thank you very much. And with that, we come to the conclusion of this panel. I want to thank the panelists. Please give them another round of applause. Really got answered. And the floor now, I turn the floor to Dr. Ray.
I second what you said, Abdelhamid, and I thank you for staying here. The extra time was worth it. We have the Palestinian version of hamburger, chicken sandwich, and vegetarian. It's wrapped up in a nice piece of paper that you all invited to enjoy. So it's lunchtime. In 45 minutes, we'll reconvene here. I hope the speakers will be around, but please give them a chance to eat a bite. Thank you.